Hi, I'm Drew Levanti, and welcome back to Elections Weekly, a show where I take you on a tour of the week ahead through the lens of electional astrology. Make sure to like and comment on the video, and subscribe to my channel for more content on electional astrology and beyond. Today, we're going to be looking at elections from the week of Tuesday, January 18th, 2022. I'm in Chicago, so all the elections will be set for my location. You can make the charts roughly equal in your location just by copying the time. You don't have to switch time zone or anything, just use the same time that I use and you'll get approximately the chart that I'm using, but you should double check in some kind of chart software so that you can make sure that you're using the same thing. Our first chart this week is January 18th. It has a Pisces rising with Jupiter conjunct the ascendant, and the moon is in Leo, opposing Mercury retrograde and Saturn. The first step when we look at any day is going to be observing what the moon is up to. What aspects is it making? What sign is it in? And based on the placement and the condition of the moon, we can then decide, okay, well, where in the chart are we going to want to put the moon? Do we want to emphasize what the moon's doing? Do we want to de-emphasize it? And there are cases where we'll want one or the other. So when we look at this election and all of the possible elections on this day, we see that the moon is opposing Saturn and it's opposing Mercury retrograde. So the first thing when I see a moon-Saturn aspect, especially a difficult one like the opposition, is that we're going to need this to be a day chart because Saturn's influence over the moon, Saturn's restrictions, and Saturn's boundaries and limitations are going to be a little bit easier to navigate for the moon when the chart has the sun above the horizon, because that warmth of the day will make that very cold aspect a little bit more manageable. So in addition to making the chart a day chart, my strategy for this election is to make the moon cadent. So the cadent houses are houses 3, 6, 9, and 12. Cadent houses are the parts of the chart where things are falling away from prominence. So it's like they have their moment in the spotlight, and then in the cadent houses, they have their moment after the spotlight. And so what it's like to be moving away from power or diminishing in strength is what these cadent houses tend to be about. It's decreasing the velocity and the intensity of that aspect by putting it in a place that doesn't get to announce itself all the way around the chart. It doesn't get to sing in the chart. It's more like a background noise that might be a little bit distracting, but the emphasis of the chart is in other places. And where is that emphasis? Well, quite clearly, it's with Jupiter being conjunct the ascendant in its own sign. Ask Jupiter for power and protection rather than the moon. So with Jupiter being on an angle like this, it makes it the most prominent energy in the entire chart. It's the ruler of the ascendant, and it is being born in this moment. It is at that union of sky and earth where things gain articulation. And so this is very much an individual articulating themselves on their own terms in a way that is comfortable and assured. The influence of Jupiter is supportive in any number of activities, anything that requires a lifted spirit and optimism. Jupiter is excellent at inspiring us into action and making us believe in what we're doing. That is an incredibly versatile form of support. So no matter what you're doing, if you need to believe in yourself or the work of the organization that you're supporting, this is a great chart. Now, with the activity between the 6th and the 12th houses, with the moon opposing Mercury retrograde and Saturn, we can think of this as something is perhaps hidden to the individual. It would be good to avoid this chart for contracts in particular, because Mercury is retrograde, and Mercury in general, when it's retrograde, it's good to avoid contracts, except sometimes you just got to do it. So if you did need a contract election, I would still avoid this one, even though it has this versatile support from Jupiter, because Mercury retrograde is the ruler in this chart of the 7th house of the other party. So this would indicate that the other party has something that they might be holding over you, or something they're not telling you, something that's secret and obscured by the dim light of Saturn, something that is out of sight in the 12th house and that you would need to watch out for. So you don't want to enter a contract where that's the situation. So we would definitely want to avoid this one, or if we had to use it, we would want to be aware of that going into it. This chart also has an angular Mars. That is something that we kind of have to accept in order to have a strong ascendant ruler. So with Mars being in the 10th house. This is a chart for something that can stir up controversy. Angular Mars is often seen in charts where people are disagreeing with each other, or if there are conflicting opinions and they don't exactly see eye to eye. But Mars is in Jupiter's sign, and Jupiter is the most powerful planet in this chart by far. Mars is still answering to Jupiter in some way. So that's why I see this as acceptable. The ruler of the ascendant is so empowered to carry out its wishes. Our second chart is for Wednesday, January 19th at 10:51 a.m. It's an Aries rising with Mars in Sagittarius in the 9th house, ruling the ascendant, and the moon is in Leo in the 5th house, moving into a trine with Mars. This chart emphasizes philosophy for sure, because the ruler of the ascendant is in the 9th house, which regards philosophical matters, religious matters, astrology, prediction, all of these ways that we imagine the future, the ways that we project ourselves forward into the future, following trends. Big trends are also 9th house topics. So if you're taking part in a big trend, if you have a specific way that you're offering predictions publicly, whether through astrology or tarot, or I think in last week's episode, I even talked about like economic forecasting being something that would belong to the 9th house, or if you're somebody who follows markets and does stuff with that. I know a lot of people who are into astrology are also into that. So this would be a chart for those people. It would also be a chart for people who want to set themselves apart in some philosophical domain. If you have ideas, if you have things that you want to share, instructions or advice that you want to give people, coaching would be a good use of this chart. We see this 9th house emphasis alongside the moon being in the 5th house. And the 5th house is the place of children, yes, but it's also the place of students. Students are children, or students are somebody who are kind of like children to you, right? Like you're sharing information with them, you're sharing wisdom with them, trying to bring them up from their ignorance in a way that's gentle. So with the moon being in the 5th house here, we have an attention given to receiving students. This chart has a lot to do with outreach as well, because we see the moon making this contact also to the 11th house, where Saturn and Mercury retrograde are. This is an 11th house in which claims are being heard and judged. Mercury is retrograde and scrutinizing certain information, along with Saturn, which is an influence that's going to make Mercury more careful, more hesitant, less likely to leap to conclusions, or less likely to follow you to your conclusions. And this moon in the 5th house is carrying light from Mercury and Saturn, and it's bringing it to Mars. And Mars rules the ascendant. So this is like the person or the organization undertaking an action are receiving some kind of information about the audience that they're presenting to. The person is learning what the audience doesn't know, or learning what their hesitations are, or the audience is making new realizations and trying to bring them into practice. When Mercury gets too far from the sun, that's when it retrogrades. It achieves this distance. It reaches its mind out and tries to invent. And then at a certain point, it must bring itself back to the sun. It must integrate what it has learned. And that is what Mercury is doing this position. The reason I chose this chart instead of another chart on this day is because this is a point where Mars becomes considerable as an ascendant ruler, as a planet that we want to make the ruler of the first house. With Mars being in Sagittarius, there are only a very few number of places in Sagittarius, specific degrees, where Mars has essential dignity, where Mars has some access to resources or an awareness of the environment that facilitates its success. Between 26 degrees and the end of Sagittarius is the Egyptian bound of Mars. And so we see Mars here at 26 degrees of Sagittarius, which means that Mars is now capable of understanding the rules. Its assertiveness is respected because it is able to use the language of the place where it is. The next chart is for Thursday, January 20th at 2:24 p.m. It's a Cancer rising with the moon in Virgo, moving into an opposition with Jupiter, while both planets are aligned across the MC and IC axis. In other words, angles. And if you've heard me talk before, you've probably heard me talk about angles. Angles are where it's at. Angles are where things happen. Angles are pivot points. They're where our fates change. It's where directions are inflected into other directions. They're very energetic, very dynamic points. And so what this chart does is it puts the ruler of the ascendant in one of these places. It's at the root of the chart, the foundation, the part of the chart that has to do with privacy and secrecy and things that are hidden. And so the ruler of the ascendant is operating from this place of having a lot of ideas. It's in a Mercury ruled sign, having a lot of details to share. And this moon is being given this opportunity to speak and to be heard because Jupiter is looking right across it. Jupiter is magnifying the voice of the moon and announcing the moon from the midheaven, from this elevation on the MC. When you say things from high up, your voice goes further. And so Jupiter here is helping the moon do that. Particularly, this chart would be good for writing projects or for putting out writing because the ruler of the ascendant is in the third house, which deals with writing and communication and messages. And Jupiter is helping bring those messages into a more public place, into a place where there's more observation, more eyes get on this material because Jupiter is there bolstering it, making it louder. This chart also has a lot going on in the 8th house. I would not necessarily recommend this for something that involves 8th house matters a lot. So for this 8th house is a little bit complicated, and it makes me think about messy or long-standing disputes over resources, particularly shared resources. So when we see this Mercury retrograde and this Saturn and this debilitated sun all being in the 8th house, it's a very uncomfortable place. It's a combination of it's a fixed sign here in the 8th house where nobody is really budging. There's a lot of people, a lot of parties competing for these shared resources, but Saturn is really in charge here. And Saturn is probably keeping these people together longer than they want to be. Or this might be sort of like the last push to resolve some kind of miscommunication or error made in the course of an inheritance or some kind of property that's being exchanged hands, some purchase. Those are possibilities for using this chart, although I would look for it more in the sense of this 3rd, 9th house activity. So look to use it for information and sharing information primarily. The next chart is for Friday, January 21st at 4:35 a.m. It's a Sagittarius rising, and Jupiter is in Pisces in the 4th sign and in the 3rd quadrant house. The moon is in Virgo, separating from an opposition with Jupiter and moving into a trine with Venus, who is retrograde in the 2nd sign. This chart is another one that's good for writing information, messages. A lot of these charts coming up this week for some reason. Maybe that's because that's what I'm doing. Yeah, that's funny. So we see the moon here in the 10th sign. It's in a Mercury ruled sign. So this 10th sign has a lot to do with writing or information or categories and naming things, connecting dots, strategy. These are all mercurial topics that this moon is succeeding in really well, even though Mercury is retrograde. So the ruler of the moon is retrograde, and that might signify like in the long term, there's some kind of decay. This isn't necessarily something that's going to last a long time, but it might see some immediate success, some immediate reputation with this strong moon in the 10th. And this moon is in between benefic aspects. So even though its ruler is retrograde, and even though its next aspect to Venus, Venus is retrograde too, this is like delivering on the promises of information already learned or knowledge already gained. There might be ways in which you've recently started to appreciate some part of your past, particularly related to the Venus retrograde and where that activates your chart. And this election can be a way for you to make public some of the results of that, or if there's some way in which your thinking has changed as a result of the Venus retrograde, then this is a chart where you can effectively communicate that change. Even if you're still finding the words with Mercury retrograde conjunct Saturn, This is certainly a time to begin to start trying to articulate what this growth is. With Jupiter being transferred to Venus by the moon, we can think about prosperous relationships, a lot of love, very simple Venus Jupiter, right? Protection of Venusian types, protection of the garden, or protection of the arts. Jupiter's protection is being offered to Venus here by the translating light of the moon. And this is a chart that could involve some financial gain. We see that Venus in the second sign is ruling the midheaven. The midheaven is often the part of the chart that describes what is happening. So if we have the first house, we have the actant, the actor, whoever that is. And then the midheaven, we have what's going on, what is the action really about? This 10th house cusp really shows us why, what's going on here, what's being offered, what's being produced, what's being practiced. So with Venus retrograde ruling that place and it's in the second house, there's definitely some kind of meditation or contemplation happening around finances. Maybe it's even just working toward finances and working toward finances in a way that is going to have some long-term benefits. This chart also has a strong Mars in the first house. Remember, we spoke about Mars being in its own Egyptian terms here at the end of Sagittarius. So this is an election where setting oneself apart, individualizing oneself, articulating oneself as oneself rather than as a part of a group, all of these things can go well in this chart, especially if it involves philosophy or belief with Jupiter ruling the ascendant. And another thing about Mars's condition here is that Mars's next aspect is actually to Jupiter. So we can say that Mars is being given the resources that it needs in Sagittarius in order to be inspired and bring things to positive ends for itself, for the individual. Our next election for the week is Saturday, January 22nd at 9:56 p.m. It's a Libra rising ruled by Venus retrograde in the fourth house, and the moon is conjunct the ascendant in Libra, and it's in a trine with the sun. This is a really good chart for learning. The moon in the first house in an air sign is bringing airy things to the first house. It's helping the first house, the individual undertaking the action, receive ideas. Maybe it's ideas about relationships. Maybe it's ideas about the fourth house, about old things, about the past, about the dead, about the land where you live. This is another chart that emphasizes students because the fifth house is so full. It could also emphasize children. This could also be a chart for setting boundaries with children. We have this Saturn in the fifth house, which is quite strong. We have this Mercury retrograde as well. Mercury is a planet that can on its own signify children, even if it's not in the fifth house. So this retrograde Mercury can sometimes show like misbehavior. When a planet goes backwards in the sky, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, what the heck's it doing? And there's this Saturn here who's like this disciplinarian figure who is clamping down on it and telling it, don't do that. This could also be a great election for revisiting creative work and especially getting feedback on existing creative work, because this first house moon is very receptive to the ideas of other people, especially because it's in Libra. Even if with Venus retrograde, there's some delay in fully receiving or being able to express appreciation, or maybe you don't fully realize the ways in which it's helpful until later. We see this sun here, this 11th house ruling sun being placed in the fifth house, and it's debilitated. So it's as if the children are hosting an unwelcome guest who's like taking up all the attention. Overall, this chart is definitely a more private, home-oriented chart. We do have the ruler of the ascendant placed in the fourth house, and it is retrograde, nearing the end of its retrograde phase, which does show a change of directions, a change in the focus of the individual undertaking this election. In the fourth house, this change might regard home or family or ancestors or land. This chart is also during the retrograde cazimi of Mercury. What does that mean? We see that Mercury and the sun are exactly conjunct, right? So this moment marks the halfway point in the Mercury retrograde. It is at this halfway point that solutions tend to present themselves. It's like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to get this communication thing working again, or we just got to be a little bit patient. Our next election for the week is Sunday, January 23rd at 7:47 a.m. It's got an Aquarius rising, Saturn is conjunct the ascendant, and the Sun and Mercury are also sitting there with it. We've got the Moon in Libra in the 9th sign, and it's moving into a square with its ruler Venus, who's sitting there retrograde in the 12th house. So this election is all about Saturn. So this is an election where one is mobilizing their authority. This is a pretty good chart for getting people to come to you and meeting you on your terms. And the reason for this in the chart is that the ruler of the 7th house is the Sun, and the Sun is in Saturn's house. So it's like, at the end of the day, the other people have to play by your rules. And so it can be good for setting expectations, helping people understand what must be done in the terms that you set them. The ascendant here is really setting the rules. The ascendant, the individual, is taking control of the situation. There's a question of how much or how well does this person share their power? This process of rebirth can be very exhausting for Saturn. Saturn can sometimes compensate for being beleaguered by being grumpy. Try not to be grumpy. This is a pretty good chart for money. We've got Jupiter in the 2nd sign in a day chart, and it's also in a square with the midheaven. So Jupiter from this 2nd house, 2nd sign position has a lot of access to the sort of moving and shaking part of the chart, this MC where all the action happens. So financial opportunity is certainly available in this chart, and it's financial opportunity that is given life, you could say, by the authority that the individual has. It would be good to have like an existing relationship with Saturn, because look, Saturn is the planet of obstacles. And so when we do an election that's based on Saturn, we want to make sure that it is we who are the obstacle, not we who meet the obstacle. We're not inviting Saturn to just throw a wall in our face. We are inviting ourselves to climb the wall. So with the Moon in Libra, this is not an election that really emphasizes the Moon a ton. The Moon does have reception from Venus, which signifies some kind of exchange of resources, some kind of back and forth is possible here, where, if the Moon is making an aspect to a malefic, people usually go separate ways. But when there's reception, there is some affinity or some desire to get along present in the election. Reception good. When I work with reception in elections, it often indicates this mutuality, this willingness to work together. And the last election of the week is January 24th, Monday at 10:04 p.m. I set this chart so that the Moon would be at 0 degrees of Scorpio. This is definitely an election where you're going to have to check based on your own location, because the Moon will be in a different place. I prefer to have the Moon in Scorpio here because it's in a tight applying aspect with Mars. Reception good. This is an election for problem-solving finances. And the reason for this is because this Moon is in the 2nd house. It's not super happy, but it has ways of solving problems. And what I mean by this in the chart is that the Moon has Mars on the phone. I like reception, and Mars knows exactly what to do. So this chart is very much about growth from a state of financial anxiety to a state of financial sufficiency. You look at this Moon in Scorpio and you say, well, Drew, the Moon has fallen in Scorpio. Why would we want to do that? Why wouldn't we have put the Moon in Libra? You waited until 10 p.m. on this Monday to choose your election when you could have had a perfectly fine Moon in Libra. And while there is something to that, I like reception. I like collaboration. I like mutuality. In addition to the aspect from the Moon to Mars, the Moon also contacts Jupiter later on. And Jupiter is in the 6th house, the 6th sign, which regards problem solving. So the Moon has this help to make improvements in the 2nd house, even though it's in this position of fall. And when planets are fallen, they're on the ground, they're looking up. And a lot of times they can feel like they're so far that they have to climb. But in this election, that low place is given plenty of hands, plenty of assistance to pull it up. The issue with the moon in Scorpio can sometimes be, well, I identified the problems and now I'm just going to keep obsessing over the fact that there's a problem. Whereas in this chart, yes, it is a moon in Scorpio, but Mars's attention is being given to the moon through this aspect. And so this exalted Mars, which is all about focus and direction and where are we going, what's the long-term view, and Mars is able to share this perspective with the moon so that it doesn't get stagnant in these emotional depths and in these quandaries that it's facing in the second house. It knows where to go. So that's it for this episode of Elections Weekly. Thank you all for joining me. Once again, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you all next week. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next Monday.